So again, welcome. And Yvette knows me a little bit. We have cubicles kind of near. Oh, no, you don't actually. You're in a different building. But I am the nonprofit librarian for the Pikes Peak Library District. And I always like to say that my job is to give people in our community the information they need to do good. And I really love this job and that I get to meet just some tremendous people who are working so hard to improve the community in which I live and work. And so I like to do anything I can to help those individuals who are doing great things for El Paso County and for Colorado statewide. So, like I said, if you have any questions, don't feel free to jump in and either put that in chat or to just unmute and ask me a question, because that's great. So let's see, we'll move on. And we already did our introduction. So today, hopefully at the end of today's session, you should be able to describe what to include in a standard project budget, identify a few best practices in a project budget, understand the basic terminology used in project budgets, and summarize the project budget process and really have confidence to get started. And so I'm gonna go through and we'll talk about what funders want to see in a budget, what are the pieces of that budget, and I'm also going to talk about, in fact, I have a lot of terminology, and we'll also go through a lot as far as kind of numbers. So just be prepared for that. So terminology, there is a lot of grant terminology, and I gave you a handout in the email, and you can use that as a resource, review it later, keep it. So maybe when you are applying for a grant, you can refer back to that when you come across some terminology that you're not quite sure what it means. I'm going to cover just a few. And normally I ask folks if they have a 501c3 letter of determination. And that really applies if you are a nonprofit and you're trying to get private funding. So that's not government funding, but it's private funding. A 501c3 designation comes from the IRS, and it's often, you might hear the term nonprofit designation, and there's actually 29 different types of nonprofit organizations with the IRS. And the 501c3 is the type that allows the organization to issue a tax receipt for a donation. And in order to apply for grants, organizations really need to either have that 501c3 designation letter within the last 5 years or a fiscal sponsor. And some people who I meet in this job are just new to starting a nonprofit. And a lot of people haven't ever heard of a fiscal sponsor. It probably doesn't apply really to either one of you, but I'll just briefly, in case you come across this sometime, a fiscal sponsorship is a formal agreement between a 501c3 and a public benefit organization that does not have that standing. And it's going to be a formal agreement with the organization, and it will include language that states that the organization can use the 501c3's tax exempt code for purchases, how the financials for the program will be handled. And there's probably going to be an administrative fee and what that percentage or that amount is. So 501c3s are pretty nifty. I always call them kind of like an umbrella organization that allows nonprofits or folks who want to become nonprofits later on, they can come in under this umbrella and be able to do their projects without having that designation letter. So we'll go on, we'll talk about different types of employees. Of course, there's a regular employee, so that's someone employed by the organization, a volunteer, someone whose assistance you rely on to implement the program but is not paid for their service. A contractor is someone who provides a certain function for a set amount. The specifics are typically spelled out in a contract or some kind of memorandum of understanding. And when you fill out your project budget, you're going to need to know all this information, or you're going to go to your finance person who's going to help you with this information. Most grant proposals are going to ask for an audit. And that is specifically going to be an examination of the financial statements by an accounting professional to determine whether they conform to accounting standards. So most of the time, a grant proposal, a funder is going to ask for an independent audit. I will tell you that I was reviewing grants last summer and somebody didn't have their audit and wrote a note and said, well, if you want to see it, just let me know and I'll get one. You're kind of like, but we asked for it ahead of time. So you really want to make sure that when you are writing a grant, and especially this, when they're asking for information about budgetary information, that you are able to provide everything that is asked for by the funder. So an organizational budget, another item that's going to be asked for. This is the budget where the organization outlines its entire year's worth of projected revenue and expenses. And the board of directors typically votes on an organization's budget. A year-to-date budget, this is the actual budget of the date as of the dates of when the proposal was submitted. This should show the projected budget amount from the organization budget and the actual amount of income received and expenses paid to the date of the report and the differences between the budgeted and actual. So again, if you don't have the information, you would contact your finance department to help with that. Your project and program budget. This is the budget for the actual project or program you are applying for, and that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. And then direct and indirect costs, I'm going to go over this a lot more in detail. Essentially, though, the direct costs are the costs directly related to the project or program. If you cannot provide the program without this expense, it's considered a direct cost. An indirect cost, however, those are the costs of doing business. That's going to be like your utilities, your telephone, your internet, that type. So any questions about that? Like I said, you've got a handout. So what do funders want to see in your project budget? Think of your budget as kind of telling a story. And really your budget should tell your story and mirror your written proposal. So the budget I'm going to talk about today will be hopefully flexible enough, like I said, to use however the funder requests it. But whatever you do, make sure you follow their specific guidelines. Funders want to see the true cost of the project. And most funders want to see where all the money is coming from. Most funders do not expect to be the sole funder, something else to think about. So now we're going to talk about the components of a project budget. And there's two main categories. Each of them are super important, right? And should be balanced out. And I'll explain both of those as we go along. So first, we're going to talk about expenses. So again, direct costs, as I just mentioned before, that's everything that is directly necessary in order to complete your project, which includes the personnel that are working directly on the project and all the non-personnel costs that are needed in order to make the project successful. Indirect costs, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Again, everything will need to be fully described when asking for money from a funder. So you should know your project. Now, if you are a grant writer and you're working for you've been hired by a nonprofit, you still really need to sit down and you really need to understand and know that project. And that enables you to be able to plan your budget. I've got just a little, I know there's just two of us, but I've got a little poll here. And who do you think should be involved in drafting your project budget? I know we haven't really gone into this, but give it a thought here. And this is multiple choice. So all right. And you can pick more than one if you think. And I'm going to end this. So our choices were the executive director, someone from the finance or accounting department, the grant writer. It should be a team effort, the program manager, or just anybody you can find hanging around the office. So I'm going to stop sharing. And you are really going to need to work with the finance people in your organization if possible. Again, I work with really small nonprofits, and sometimes it's just one or two people with some volunteers. But as you guys picked out right away, a proposal is best when created by a team. And your team really might involve the executive director. It would definitely include somebody from the finance or accounting department. It might be if you hire an outside grant writer or whoever is, of course, writing the grant. It might be the program manager or program or project manager if you have one. So those are all really important, but it really should be a team effort because that's the way a project comes together in the easiest and most complete manner. Again, I kind of mentioned before, your budget is really essentially a financial narrative of your proposal. And a lot of grant makers are going to look at the budget first. They're going to check to ensure that it can be clearly understood. You are trying to make a story told by your budget. What funders don't want to see are things they don't understand. What's really important for you is to eliminate any questions. You are trying to make it as clear as possible as to why you are buying these particular things or why you're spending money to run this project in the first place. Now, you really need to know how much your project's going to cost. You should get at least 3 estimates. You don't always have to get the lowest estimate. That's generally for government. So if you are giving a government grant, you might need to go with the lowest bidder. Private funders, however, generally don't require that lowest bid. You really should choose the estimate that best supports your project and is the most reasonable. You may not have to, but you can always attach a budget narrative explaining where the estimate came from. Really be honest and be clear, don't guess. And don't round up. Like you could say maybe $11,400, but don't say $12,000. Funders are going to be looking for discrepancies to ask questions about. You don't want them to have to come back and ask you questions. If you are clear, you really shouldn't run into any problems. And I'll tell you, as an example, I was working with an organization and they have a orphanage in Africa. And they had one sole funder. So, right, that's like one key thing that I heard, because their sole funder walked away. And so then they had no other revenue streams coming in. And so they suddenly came to me and said, well, we need to find money. And how do we find money? And I said, okay, what do you need to get funded? And they said, well, everything. And I said, well, no. We need to break this down and figure out how much each project is going to cost. And so we sat there and brainstormed out, well, they have a fish farm. They need money to drill a new well for water. So instead of having this blanket, just like we need money, we sat down and figured out project costs for each project. And that's how they are able to, they're able to then search for funding based on each project. So super important to know that. All right, so now we're going to move on. And, we talked about how direct costs are divided into personnel and non-personnel. And personnel essentially are all the individuals who are working on the project, even if they are not spending all their time on the project. So the executive director may not spend all their time on the project, but they are part of getting the project done. So you're going to think, besides the executive director, who else is working on the project? You also need to know how much time they are dedicated to the project. And so maybe an executive director makes, I'm just going to throw out really large round numbers, but maybe an executive director makes $100,000 a year, but they only spend 5% of their time on the project. In that case, you would calculate how much funding you are going to need. Oh, it looks like we have somebody that has come in. Welcome. There we go. Oh, or they disappeared. Oh no, they're here. All right, so welcome. And if you wouldn't mind, if you haven't turned your camera off, because we're recording, and that just makes for a really good, clean recording if we don't have any other cameras on. But Nancy, feel free to ask any questions. You can put it in chat or unmute and ask a question. So let's see. Oh, so I was saying, maybe an executive director makes $100,000 a year, but they only spend 5% of their time on the project. In that case, you would calculate how much funding you're going to need for them based on their salary. So again, they get $100,000 a year, but work on the project 5% of the time. That means you're going to put down 5% of 100,000 or 5,000. If they make $50,000 and spend 100% of their time on the project, then you would put down 50,000. It's going to be different for the different people on the project, depending on how much time they are spending and how much money they make. You want to be careful with this part, as you don't want to say your executive director spends 25% of their time on 5 different projects, right? Because obviously you add all that up and they're spending 125% of their time to all these projects, which of course isn't possible. So again, you want to make sure that everything is clear and accurate. Really, I like to use the word transparent. So you want to talk to your financial person or whoever keeps track of time in order to ensure that you are correctly representing everyone's time. You will have then a subtotal, but that's not the total cost of personnel. There is one more cost that you need to think about, and that is the cost of fringe benefits. You don't just pay money, you also more than likely pay benefits unless you are an all-volunteer organization. Each organization is different, but you may have to pay health or dental benefits. There's taxes you probably have to pay. Overall, the organization pays a certain amount. So again, maybe you're a really big organization and you pay $1 million for everything, salary and benefits. But for all the taxes and benefits, you pay $100,000. So you would divide 100,000 by $1 million, which is 10%. It's not going to be 10% for every organization, but your financial person will know what everyone makes and how much is paid out for benefits. You can then divide out and find out what your fringe benefit rate is. You then multiply it out. So if all your salaries for all the projects total $100,000 and your fringe benefit rate is 10%, you would multiply 100,000 times 10 to get 10,000. Adding the subtotal of 100,000 plus 10,000 gives you 110,000, which is your personnel total. You don't want to lowball the funder. Be honest so that you don't end up having to ask the funder for additional funds separately to pay for fringe benefits. So, I know that was a lot. I promise you that I will be sending my slides and the recording. So, oops, I forgot to do that. So now we're going to go on. Was there any questions? I know that was so much information. Okay, so now we're going to talk about non-personnel costs. So these are other direct costs that involve everything else that is directly related to running the project. Not the people who are employees, but the people you hire maybe as consultants. Oh, come on. They don't get the benefits, but they may have hourly costs. What is listed here? So we have supplies, printing, travel, etc. That'll be different for every project. Everything that you have to spend money on to make the project successful needs to be listed in the non-personnel costs. And travel, which I just clicked and took away, sorry about that. Maybe from reading the proposal narrative, the funder would understand what it is, what all is included in travel, but a better way is to explain it. This is called a budget narrative. Travel, maybe put in the middle, so you could put a column right here. And it could be travel tips for seniors for the schools that they're working in. So 10 bus trips at $100 a bus trip equals $1,000. But what that budget narrative does is it tells the person that this is necessary. That's why it's here. Program equipment, space, evaluation, these are all important, but you have to have equipment in your office. Then, so you need to put what equipment is important for the program, and that's going to be listed here. You want to make sure that all of those costs are then added up. So we went through some of the components here of the project budget, and the direct costs of both personnel and non-personnel are going to add up to one number, but we aren't done yet with expenses. So we need to add in indirect costs. And so let's go on and talk about indirect costs. And, so you can get a grant for general operating costs, but it's often more difficult. Funders really like to give to a project so they can see where their money is going to. It's a little bit flashier. That's not to say that you can't get money for general operating costs. And I will say that because of COVID, funders have changed things a little bit, and they've loosened up some and understand that maybe nonprofits, in order to keep going, just need general operating costs covered. And so there are a lot more grants out there to cover general operating funds. But another way to get some funding for operating costs is to add it into your program as overhead or hidden costs. And this, I think, is a great visual to understand the difference between direct and indirect costs. So you have the direct, or the visible costs up here at the top. And that's the iceberg above the water line. Then you have those hidden costs, which are all important to the project, but are also used on other projects as well. Everything listed is indirectly related to the project. So, rent, utilities, telephone, the staples, the administrative staff, all of that is going to be your hidden or indirect costs. So how do we calculate indirect costs? Again, you can always talk to your financial person or whoever fills out the 990. And if you're not sure what a 990 is, that is the tax form that all nonprofits need to submit to the IRS annually. And on your 990, there's going to be a line for your total indirect costs. The 990 asks you to calculate your indirect costs, and it asks you to list how much you spend on direct programs and how much you spend on support services and fundraising. That support services and fundraising total is used to calculate your indirect cost rate. So with this example that I have here on the screen, the total direct costs in running these programs is $500,000. So we've got that big, nice round number here. But the indirect costs, the rent, the utilities, I made up and said that that's $100,000. So the indirect cost is the total direct costs divided by the total direct costs, which is the indirect cost rate is the total indirect cost divided by the total direct cost. I'm not sure if I said that correct. So in this particular case, the rate is 20% or $100,000 divided by $500,000. Your organization will have different numbers, of course, right? Your indirect cost rate may be higher at 30%, or it might be lower at 10%, but it's going to depend on how much you spend on direct and indirect costs. There is really no right number. The Better Business Bureau and other organizations generally recommend indirect costs being no higher than 30 to 35%, but it's really going to depend on your organization. You may run an organization that requires a higher overhead, say a residential care facility, or if you run maybe just a website and only a website, your indirect costs are going to be so much different. What are you going to do though when you have a funder that says they will not cover indirect costs? What do you do then? Well, they're still part of your budget, and they're always going to be part of your budget. There may be a way to make a case to your funder that you aren't going to use their funds as part of your indirect costs, so it's not going to change your budget, but you still have to have it in there, and it's going to change how you make the ask. There are funders out there who say they will not pay for personnel or computers or whatever. You will then have to say that you are asking for support of X program, but you aren't going to use any of the awarded funds towards indirect costs. You might be able to go back to the funder later and say, is there any possibility you might change your mind? These indirect costs are really important to helping make the project run smoothly. And there's the potential that you could get them to change your mind. Any questions on this? I know so many numbers, and I try to just use big round numbers.
So I have a question, Katie. So direct cost, we're saying, is travel and per diem. Is indirect cost accommodations, or is that directly in travel as well?
I would think that that would be directly, that would also be in travel.
Okay.
Because that's directly related to travel.
Right. That's what I thought, but you had mentioned rent and utilities, and what I'm trying to do this summer is do some research over in Scandinavia.
Okay.
And so I'm looking for housing assistance and the travel portion of it. So
right. I would, from my experience, I would say that's indirect cost, because that definitely is part of your travel, right? Your travel getting there, your food and your lodging, that's generally all considered a direct cost, because you can't do that project overseas without those direct cost funding, which would be travel. Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Sure. So we are now back to our screen here about the components of a project budget. So we went through the expenses portion, which tends really to be more complicated. But before we move on, I will do just a couple quick little polls about what we just talked about in direct and indirect costs. So I'm going to, let's see, pull up. All right. Since we just talked about this, what do you think should be included in direct costs? Pretty easy, I hope. All right, so I'm going to end that poll and share the results. So really, it is all of the above. So any of the answers are accurate. Hopefully you would put add in everything. So your amazing staff, anything directly necessary to make the project amazing, your supplies and your travel. So really all of the above. All right. And then the next one, your indirect costs. So what do you think should be included in those indirect costs? And and I goofed on this one, guys. I don't know if I can edit it. Shoot. Well, pick the best answer. Oh no, it is multiple choice. I did do that right. So you can pick as many as you think. Personally, I think the giant stuffed Sasquatch for the office, that's just vital. I'm just kidding. I'll just give it a minute here. I had so many options this time. All right. So pretty much all of this are indirect costs, especially if you're going to say share that admin stuff. You know, again, this could be if you're a large nonprofit and that has multiple projects going at one time. You're going to share the admin staff, you're going to share those papers and pens, the telephone, the rent, everything. All right, so let's move on. So we're going to move on to income, which is equally important, but hopefully, you know, not as complicated. And when we think about income, yes, we are talking about grants, but we're also talking about everything else that brings an income that goes in support of your project. So that can be earned income or any fees that you collect or from the sale of any goods. And I like to show income like I would show a budget, but by categories, because it shows that you are diversifying, right? My example of the orphanage in Africa, they had not diversified their funding so that when one of their, you know, when that funding stream disappeared, they were left with no funding. You don't want that to happen. You really want to show that you are diversifying your funding. If you remember from, if you've taken any of my previous classes, which I'm not quite sure about, Nancy, on grant seeking, the biggest source of funding is from individuals, not from foundation grants. A funder might wonder about why you are asking for so much money and want to see where else you are getting funding from. Or they might ask what would happen to the program if they didn't fund it the following year. So showing where you are getting all your income is vital. So funders are clear as to where all your money comes from. I might add another column here that says status, and some funders actually might require it, but a status column is going to let the funder know about the money that you already have on hand, and if it is committed money that you have, or if it is pending. So money that you're expecting. And oftentimes you can make a strong case for needing the funder's money by showing that you have all the money you need except the money that you're asking for from them. And one of the handouts I sent you guys ahead of time was a sample budget. And budgets are generally like, we're spending all this time talking about budgets. Generally speaking, it is going to be one page. So I have, I created just a sample budget that's a one-page budget, and that is what you guys have as one of your handouts. So again, this may not apply to all of you, but now we're going to talk about in-kind support, and it's kind of tricky because it's not just income, but it should also be represented as the expenses too. In-kind support means anything that is given to you not in the form of money. So that could mean volunteer service or something like a gift of computers. You know, say a funder can't give you money, but still wants to support your project. And so they gift you 50 computers. And that is an in-kind contribution. You're going to use those computers for your after-school reading and tutoring program. You would then include the cost of those computers if you were going to have to pay for them. If someone were to donate a space, that would also be an in-kind contribution. What would the value of that space be? Well, it would be whatever you would have had to pay for it. You know, think how much does it cost to rent, you know, an office space in this area. So I am on a board of directors for a nonprofit, and another nonprofit is gifting us some space in their office. So when we are creating our budget, we are going to put down how much that would have cost to rent that location. That is where you get the value of in-kind contributions. Even though they are not cash, they still have a value. You should also list it as an expense too, because while they represent what you got for free, you also are going to list what you would have had to pay for it if you had not received it for free. So if you list 50 computers as in-kind contributions, you also need to list them as an expense and what they are for. Both totals need to be the same. You can even use the same budget narrative explaining what they are and what they are being used for, but list it on both sides. Volunteer time can be a little confusing. You list your volunteers as an expense for the project because you otherwise would have had to pay for them, right? You also are going to list them as an expense, and you list them as an in-kind contribution. Where do you get the value of volunteer time? Well, you can get them in two places. What would you have had to pay if they were working for you? This might be especially true if you had a lawyer who was volunteering their time for your project. Say they normally charge $150 an hour and they volunteer 10 hours, you would list that. You could also get that directly from a particular individual. So another nonprofit I worked with, they run an equine recovery nonprofit, and they have a vet who comes in and gifts their time to the nonprofit. And so you're going to ask the vet, well, how much would you have normally charged per hour? And that's what you would put into your budget. So another place to get it is from, oops, shoot, I didn't want to go there yet. Well, that's okay, from independentsector.org. So independent sector calculates the value of volunteer time. The value is set by them every year for the nonprofit world. And so the value varies by location and by the type of work. If you go to their website, you would search for value of our volunteers. That number can then be used to calculate how much in-kind volunteer work is worth. And then, you know, and you would let the funder know this is where you found that number. So if you scroll down, here's a map, and you can create a free account, and so that you can get exact numbers for your state. But if I just click on the map, it's going to give me the national estimate. So right now, the current estimate for each volunteer hour is $28.54. And it generally updates every year in April. So we can come back next month and see what the national value of each volunteer hour is worth there. So let me just get back to our slide. And we'll move on. So we've talked about a lot of what's going to be required. There, you might be asked for additional documents, and many of these can be requested again from your I talk so much about the financial person at your organization. I'm going to hope that you have one, even if you're really small. So again, like one of the boards I'm on, one of our board members handles all of our financial documents, and there's only 5 of us on the board. If you are unable to supply the documents that the funder is requesting, then it's a really good idea to contact them and ask what else you could provide instead. Don't just not include it in your request, like that example I talked about earlier. You see a budget narrative. So, you know, it really needs to be clear and concise. And I recommend either attaching to your budget or having it as a footnote. It is suggested that you have a one-page budget, as I recommended, but you could add that budget narrative, like I said, as a footnote, or maybe as a second piece of paper. That would be okay. I also recommend that you keep a document drawer. So that can be either a paper file in a, in a drawer, or as a folder on your computer desktop, but somewhere where it's super easily accessible, so you don't have to keep running back to your financial person or even yourself. Where did I put that form? Because if you're applying for multiple grants in a year, you're going to need a lot of the same documents. That letter of determination, your organization's budget, those type of things. So you might want to keep those in a handy spot, because I think that will make it much easier on you. So things to think about after the grant is approved. Even though we call this a project budget, remember, this isn't just a budget, this is a promise to the funder. If you make any changes, or say you ask for $20,000 for new computers, and then boom, you were gifted those new computers. You can't just do whatever you like with the money the funder granted you. Any major changes to the budget usually has to be communicated with the funder. You don't want to get on their bad side by using their money the wrong way or in a different way. Get permission. Because when you are working through the grant process, it's really relationship building. You're building a relationship with the funder. And if you are clear and transparent, you communicate well with the funder, you then have a greater chance of getting funded the next year. And also think that funding world's actually kind of small. And so if you get kind of a bad reputation, that might get known within the funding community, and you may not get funded again. So make sure you follow all the requirements, and you keep that clear communication line always open with your funder. Now, more things to consider after the grant is approved. Think about, what should you do if you're awarded the grant, but the project costs more than expected? If you are not writing the proposal, make sure you're working closely with the individual who is writing up the proposal. Maybe you're just doing this budget piece. It's really important that any variances between projected costs and actual costs need to be reported. Again, that great line of communication with your funder. Anything that costs more or less than what you explained will need to be reported. If you aren't sure that the funder will be okay with that, again, check with them. I don't think I can say that enough. So a few key takeaways. Again, know your project really thoroughly. So even if you are the one who's not writing the actual proposal, you still need to know your project really well in order to write the project budget up. You need to estimate all those direct costs. You need to include that percentage for your indirect costs, and you need to estimate all possible income. So that was a lot, and I understand. And I always think that with these type of classes, just kind of soak it all in, think about it for a little while, look at the handouts, maybe review my slides when I send them. If you have time, listen to the recording again, just so that you have a clear idea of what is required. And it takes time to understand project budgets. I also highly suggest that if you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate, reach back to me, and we can, sit down or through Zoom, discuss any questions that you may have. Before I go and show you where to find our grant seeking databases, because I promised that, any other Any questions?
I have another question.
Sure.
On the handouts, you asked how many people will be served by the program. How do I estimate that? I mean, it's a historical project, so I mean, I have no way of knowing how many people it will serve.
Right. So, again, the questions may not be applicable for all situations. Generally speaking, like if you are writing a grant and you are serving the homeless in El Paso County, right? You can get a number for how many people you are going to be serving, but in your case, you may have to come up with some other type of number, and it may not even be a question that can be answered. Okay. And it may not be a question that is asked on the grant. Would
they accept a qualitative answer?
A lot of times they do. So okay. When you're writing a grant, it asks generally for your an evaluation and sustainability piece. And so that usually asks for either qualitative or quantitative, not results, because you may not have done it yet, but it's going to ask for you to evaluate the potential of your program or your project. Sure. And so in some cases, quantitative works, and sometimes qualitative works, and sometimes the two of them together work.
Okay.
So it really all depends on your project or program.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to get out of this. And I promised that I would show. So I've got some tabs here. So I'm going to go to our library's website. Again, if you're looking at other libraries, you'll need to go to their website and see what they offer. This is the homepage for Pikes Peak Library District. And we've got this great research tab. And when you select on it, it's going to give you a lot of different options. So it's all alphabetical. You have your all databases option, which is one way to reach all of the library's databases. I usually point people to the nonprofit resources page because this enables you to see all the nonprofit databases all in one spot. So on the home page, it just gives you some information about the Rob Hilbert Room, which is a great space to come and use. It's a physical space in the Carnegie section of the Penrose Library. And it's really a space dedicated to those people who are coming to do any type of nonprofit or grant research. It's open Monday through Saturday from 10 to 5. And there's also, besides a computer that's dedicated for grant research, there's table space, chairs, you can, spread your stuff out. But we also have a large collection of nonprofit titles that are there. They are all reference titles, but what I like to tell people is if they come in and they find a book that really calls to them, another library staff member can either find that title for you in our circulating collection, or we can find it for you from outside of our library district. There are a few specialty items that you can't, like salary and compensation studies for nonprofits. Those are specifically unique, and you can't find those in many other places. So those you would need to come in and look at. We do have a copy machine. You can copy selected pages if you so desire. But if you select the databases tab, what you get is a list of the databases that I was talking about earlier. So there's that Colorado Grants Guide, Foundation Directory Online Essential, and that is the kind of pared down version of our grant seeking database. Foundation Director Online Professional. That is the database that you must be in the Penrose Library in order to access. And then here's that Grants to Individuals, which currently is still available remotely with a Pikes Peak Library District library card. So just to point all that out. Any other questions? I'm going to stop sharing. I will turn my video back on. Any questions? Again, I know I gave you guys so much information that it can take a while to think about, or you may not even need it right now, but you may need it down the road. So hopefully you just keep all the handouts I gave you. Again, especially that project budgets worksheet. That's just a way to enable you to brainstorm out some of the things I talked about. And then you can use those when you actually create a project budget. So
when you apply for these grants, how long does it typically take to receive a response?
So it all depends on who you're applying to.
Okay.
If you're applying to a large foundation, their board may meet and review grants every month, every time the board meets. If you're applying to a really small family foundation, they may only meet a couple times a year to review grants. And so what's really important is that when you are applying, you're going to be looking to see when applications are due and how often they're reviewed. When does the board meet? So most of the time you will find that information on the funder's profile page or on the grant information.
Great.
Yeah. So, then if you're applying for government grants, that can take a while. Some people, if you're applying for multiple grants for your nonprofit in a year, I recommend that you create a grant timeline and you really think about applying for grants in the term of a 1-year span, because sometimes it can take a long time to get the grant or to get the grant response. Like you're not going to apply today and see that money next month. Writing up the grant takes a long time, usually, unless you have all your information all ready to go. And then again, you have to make sure that you hit that application deadline at the right time. That's going to be appropriate for your funding needs. So I often hate to tell people that, you've got, people want money this month or next month, and it actually, the grant funding cycle doesn't generally work that way. So it takes some forethought and planning.
So if I was going to have, because I really wanted to do this summer so that I could defend my thesis this fall, it sounds like it may be unlikely to receive funds for that quickly. So if I take it out of pocket, then I can provide direct receipts for what I've paid for. And will they look at it and refund, I guess, kind of refund that money or sponsor it? Or would they look at it and say, well, she's already paid for it? So
it all depends, again, on the type of grant. And I have reviewed grants that are for projects that are ongoing and that they're basically getting paid back. So there are those grants out there. You just have to really read the application well. You need to look at the limitations. I would recommend that maybe you do look at the grants to individuals
Okay.
You might find some individual funding that way. Just remember that your searching is not going to happen in, a lunch hour. It takes some real dedicated time to search for grants.
Yeah.
Because they're big databases with tons of information. So every time you put in a search, you're going to get probably different answers. A lot of these databases are updated daily, at least Foundation Directory Online is updated daily. So I may do a practice search for a class and I do it one day, and then I do this exact same search a couple of days later and I get completely different results. It happens all the time. When you are doing searches too, you're going to figure out what is your best search strategy. And you're going to try that search strategy. And when you get too many results, you're going to use some filters and narrow that down so that you get a more manageable, more concise set of results. A lot of times I put in too many filters and I get 0 results. So then I amend that search again to get a better list of results. So you never are going to get it right on the first try. And then, like I said, you can try different databases, gives you different results. So for you, I would probably look at grants.gov. I would ask at UC Denver. You should have a grant or foundation type office that can assist you in searching for funding or help you in how to navigate, what resources are available to you. And they might be different. So, anybody else? All right. Well, if not, I wish you guys the very best, and I hope you have a great week. And like I said, after I get the video all pulled together and edit it a little bit, I will send that out with my slides. So enjoy the day, and I hope to see you again soon.